What is industrial policy and does it work? What really is the China shock? And do the rich pay their fair share in taxes? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of eConception. eConception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the consumer surplus wedge on the supply-demand graph. We're pushing really hard to try to get it a little bit bigger. Industrial policy is a topic of conversation in Washington, D.C. on both sides of the aisle. Both Democrats and Republicans, some of them anyway, have talked about industrial policy in a favorable light. They believe this is something that the U.S. government should do more of. And to talk about that today, we have Samuel Gregg, who is the Friedrich Hayek Chair in Economics and Economic History at the American Institute for Economic Research. And he's on here today to talk about industrial policy. So first of all, Sam, can we just start off with a definition? When you say industrial policy, what do you mean?
Well, that's a good place to start, Dominic, because many of the discussions about industrial policy reflect wildly varying definitions of what it means. You can go back to the late 1980s and find people saying industrial policy is economic policy, meaning that industrial policy is everything that happens in a given economy and everything that a government might do in a given economy. But I think if you look at the more serious literature on this topic, including from people who are prominent advocates of industrial policy, I think the clearest definition is interventions by the state in the form of things like subsidies, favorable tax treatment, preferential tax treatment, things that are sometimes outright grants to businesses, etc., within a particular economic sector. The game being that one is trying to produce a different economic outcome than would be otherwise produced by letting markets work. So that's what I define industrial policy as. It has a very specific meaning, and I think that's important because with that type of meaning, we can be much clearer about what we're talking about. And it also, I think, prevents advocates of industrial policy from going down rabbit holes and trying to explain that, well, every society has industrial policy at some degree, so maybe we should just embrace it. When you have a very specific definition like the one that I've offered, then you can actually have a serious conversation about what it is, what it does, whether it's successful, or as I believe, why it more often than not generally fails.
So sometimes advocates of industrial policy will try to put defense spending in the category of industrial policy. They will say this is the government intervening in one part of the economy with defense contractors that is using taxpayer money in order to influence economic activity in that specific sector. And therefore, this is all just part of industrial policy. So if you support the existence of the military, that means you support some kind of industrial policy. Do you think that view holds up?
No, I don't. And the reason is, first of all, that one of the essential functions of government, which would exist regardless of whether we had a market economy or not, is national defense and national security. So it's a category of its own. Secondly, I should mention, free marketers have always acknowledged that genuine national security concerns, and that word genuine is pretty important because a lot of things peddled as national security are not. But genuine national security needs are an exception to the free market, free trade rule. The second thing I would say is that the difference between defense policy and industrial policy is that there's one single customer for national defense policies that have this type of economic dimension to it, or at least involve expenditures on military equipment, military technology. And that customer is the United States military. There is no other customer for this good. So that tells you that it's not really a market, because in a market you have to have at least one or two people who are engaged in exchanges. In this case, there's not. There's just one. It's the United States military. And that's the same for defense policies around the world. It's the same, by the way, when America sells weapons and technology, military technology, to its allies. It's the same principle that it is at work. It's about securing the national security of a given country, and the one customer that is dealt with here is the United States military. It's not 330 million American consumers.
And so when the government is trying to replace economic activity that would otherwise occur, which is how you're saying industrial policy exists, that excludes defense policy because it would not otherwise occur without the government, because that's the government's job, as opposed to something like, producing steel, which is an important thing for the military to use at certain times, but it's not the government's job to make steel. We have lots of private companies that do that, both in the United States and around the world. We've heard these arguments made about steel. We've heard these arguments made in recent years very forcefully about semiconductors, with the understanding that because semiconductor production is concentrated in a increasingly volatile part of the world, namely in and around Taiwan, that there's a necessary national security justification for the United States to engage in industrial policy to try to move some of that production to more stable places, and especially to move it to the United States itself. Does that rise, in your view, to a national security justification that would permit an exception to this general rule of free markets?
Well, the first thing to note is that when it comes to advanced semiconductor production, the United States is already the leading country in the world that does this. So the notion that we're not producing the type of semiconductors that are necessary for highly sophisticated military equipment is not true. We are doing that in the United States, and we're doing it at an advanced level, and we're doing it at a far more advanced level than any other country in the world. What is being produced in places like Taiwan, is the country you're really talking about, is what is often called legacy semiconductors. So these are things that are used in cell phones, that are used in electrical sockets, all sorts of different things, which in one sense, I guess, have a military use because the military uses these sorts of things, but then so does lots of other things that have nothing to do with the military. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there's a lot of discussion here about dual-use technology, that certain types of technology can be used for both domestic consumer purposes and some are used for military purposes. Well, that's true, but most of those semiconductors are produced in plentiful ways by civilian manufacturers. They're not produced by the military or even for the military. It's just that the military happens to buy these sorts of things. Thirdly, American production of semiconductors started on a sort of mass level at the type of scale that we're talking about in the late 2000s and all through the 2010s, where there was no real industrial policy offered for these sorts of things. In places like Arizona, where we're having a lot of semiconductor industry setting itself up now, the road to the attraction of many of these types of firms to a state like Arizona was laid in the late 2000s and in the 2010s by two Republican governors, Governor Brewster and Governor Doug Ducey. But that was part of a general plan of deregulating as much as they could the Arizonan economy, of reducing corporate taxes to make it more attractive for companies to set up shop there, by improving things like depreciation of capital equipment, etc. In other words, the things that attracted semiconductor industries and companies to places like Arizona was the establishment of a competitive, open environment that allows people who are entrepreneurial and who are willing to be competitive to flourish. It's why lots of other businesses also move to some of these parts of the country as well, because it's a generally attractive environment. That's not industrial policy. That is clearing away regulatory sludge and disincentives to invest in a given part of the country. I'd also mention that some of these factories were set up in some of the more advanced ones were set up in 2020. There was no CHIPS Act in 2020. Companies went and set up shop in places like Arizona, Texas, and Ohio because it was an attractive environment for them. Now, I will say industrial policy has been used as part of the CHIPS Act, as you know, to try and attract firms like TSMC and other semiconductor producers from outside the United States to come and set up shop in the United States. Well, the answer is they were already here. They've been here for at least 10 years, and they've been building factories and producing the types of chips that we wanted without any industrial policy. Now, industrial policy is being used, and what are we discovering? Well, industrial policy under the CHIPS Act has a lot of strings attached. It means things like you must employ, preferably, union labor. It means that you must have certain quotas for women employees, despite the fact that women tend not to have the type of technological skills that are necessary for some of this type of production. There's a diverse commitment to diversity in these programs, right? Which the Commerce Department has interpreted as DEI. So when I hear people like Senator J.D. Vance starting to complain about, well, industrial policy seems highly politicized in the case of semiconductors, the answer is, of course it is, because all industrial policy is heavily politicized. So my point is this: we didn't need industrial policy to deal with what is, in some respects, a type of national security concern. The market was dealing with these problems rather effectively and without all the regulatory sludge or the cronyism or the politicization that is inherent to any industrial policy, whether it's designed by progressives or conservatives.
So some advocates of industrial policy will also say that all of that can be true, and it can be true that free markets are more efficient. It can be true that in theory, they clearly are superior, and that can be unassailable logically. But it is also true that other countries do industrial policy. The Europeans do it, the South Koreans do it, the Japanese do it, the Chinese do it. And these are our competitors economically. And so in order to compete with them, even though we know it to be less efficient, we still have to play the game a little bit. And one of the arguments that will often get forwarded as well is that some countries have seen success with this. If you look at the example of South Korea was a very poor country in the aftermath of the Korean War. Today, it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and their government pursued lots of industrial policies in between then and now. And so what would you say to the example of other countries and maybe the practical concerns that don't go on the theoretical?
Well, the first thing to note is that if you don't get the theory right, you don't get the ideas right, no amount of pragmatism is going to compensate for lack of, no amount of pragmatism is going to compensate for bad ideas and bad intellectual structure. So that's the first thing to note. The second thing to note is that Europe has certainly used a lot of industrial policy, and it hasn't worked. If you look at countries like France, they've been promoting what they call national champions for years in things like semiconductors and any number of cutting-edge technologies, which have produced failure after failure after failure and requests for more and more and more subsidies from the French state. That's very much the story of industrial policy in Europe. If you look at Southeast Asian countries, you mentioned South Korea, for example. A couple of years ago, I wrote a long article for Law and Liberty looking at the use of industrial policy in the seven tigers, as they're called, as well as countries like Japan. And again, you see failure after failure after failure. In fact, in 2001, Japan's finance ministry issued a paper admitting that, quote unquote, the Japanese model was not, by which they mean industrial policy, was not the cause of our success, it was the cause of our failure. That being 20 years of stagnation, which started in 1990, which had more to do with things like bad monetary policy, the demographic problems that Japan has now. But industrial policy played a role in that because it was basically used to prop up poorly performing sectors of the Japanese economy And it was highly connected to who you knew in the Liberal Democratic Party, which ruled Japan, as you know, for most of the post-war period. If you look at countries like South Korea, that's often proposed as a model for industrial policy. Well, the economist Yagba Bagwati has done a lot of work on many of these particular countries. And what you see in the case of countries like South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, even to a certain extent Indonesia, these countries really started to take off when they stopped doing industrial policy. Same with Taiwan. When they stopped doing industrial policy, which was around about the mid-1960s, late 1960s, when it was becoming very clear that this was not producing the type of economic growth and prosperity that many advocates of industrial policy promise, as will result from industrial policy. And what you saw in many of these countries was the government pulling back on industrial policy, of opening themselves up to trade with other countries. And that combination, reducing industrial policy and increasing trade with other countries, really made these economies much more efficient and competitive than they had hitherto been, which meant they attracted lots and lots of foreign investment, which is really one of the crucial ingredients for economic growth and prosperity. So when you look at all these cases and you dig down into the details, you see that industrial policy, the record of industrial policy is not as many of its proponents presented as. Or take contemporary China. China has been using industrial policy pretty heavily, especially since 2008 when they started moving away from their more limited market liberalization policies. So what do you see? You see massive failures in areas like, guess what? Semiconductors, and things like high-tech manufacturing and 3G mobile technologies. You see massive misallocations of capital throughout the economy as the communist regime pushes capital into areas of the economy that are not particularly productive. If you look at all these examples, you can find problem after problem after problem. Now, I will say that if you throw enough money into a particular segment of the economy, you're bound to get some results, right? So that is one of the things that you can say. If you put billions and billions of dollars into any particular segment of the economy, you're bound to get something, right? Something is bound to be produced. But you have to ask yourself, where could this capital, which has been used very inefficiently, where could it have been used better, more efficiently, more productively, and without all the strings and cronyism and the politicization that follows industrial policy wherever it goes? So that, I think, is the answer to people who say, well, look at other countries, it's worked. The answer is it's a much more mixed picture, and that the failure rate has become more and more evident as this has been studied over longer time periods, really beginning in the 1980s when some of these studies started to be done.
People will also look at this country and they will see, a flourishing technology sector in California. They will see a flourishing financial sector in New York. But then they see a struggling industrial sector in a lot of the Midwest. And they say, maybe we can use some industrial policy, sort of building off of the wealth that's been created on the coasts, and then use that in the interior of the country to develop there and sort of restore jobs that used to be there that have disappeared in the last couple of decades. A lot of times, advocates will say, look, we know this isn't necessarily going to be market efficient, but it would be worth it for political reasons, that it would help to create a more shared sense of participation in the economy across the country. And so this would be worthwhile for political reasons. What would you say to that argument for industrial policy here within the United States?
Well, first of all, I think the notion of engaging in that type of widespread sectoral redesign of the American economy, which is really what is being proposed, that hasn't worked out so well where it's been tried in other countries, or even in the case of the United States. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, by definition, that means moving capital into parts of the economy that are unable to produce the same degree of wealth as the other parts, but you're taking away capital from these very productive sectors and moving into sectors that are not so productive. Now, they would say, well, but isn't this worth it because it's going to produce more manufacturing jobs? Because that's really what we're talking about, right? To which the response is, even massive reallocations of capital by, I guess, state fiat, because that's the only way it would happen, right, and industrial policy, even massive reallocations of capital to particular regions that are dominated by particular industries, that's not going to produce many manufacturing jobs. Why? Because manufacturing today is all about automation. It's all about machinery. It's about technology. And the purpose of when you push capital into things like manufacturing, the purpose is to mechanize things. The purpose is to use labor-saving technology. Now, that tells us that even if you put billions of dollars into these things, they're not going to produce jobs on the scale that is being talked about because manufacturing has changed. It's not 1950s laborers working in often very dangerous and unpleasant conditions in factories in Detroit. Manufacturing today is in places like Alabama or Georgia or Texas or these southern states, what we often call the Sun Belt, or North Carolina, South Carolina. And what you find there are factories that are high-tech factories. The people walking around in these factories are not burly men who often have low levels of education. It's often highly sophisticated and well-educated, trained scientists and people specializing in particular types of technology, many of whom are women, but they're also just fewer in number. And that's what happens when you move in this particular direction. The alternative is to say, well, let's just stop using technology. Let's just put away the technology because, well, yes, I guess you could do that and you could employ people. You can throw away the power tool, right, and have people using things like saws with their hands and hammers, but no one's going to buy the product, right? So even if you had a manufacturing boom, which I don't think we're going to have, and by the way, America is in every manufacturing industry one of the top 3 countries in the world already for manufacturing. So it's not like we can become even better in that respect. We're already at the top. When you start to look at all those factors, you start to say, well, this is not going to work. Now, what is interesting, if you can go back to a 2019 Brookings Institute paper, which looked at manufacturing towns in the parts of the country that you're talking about, and it found of the 185 towns that had been heavily manufacturing based in the 1970s, 115 had shifted away from manufacturing and embraced service industries by 2016. Now, that was a long period of time. It wasn't necessarily an easy transition, but they made the transition. And of the other 70, 40 of those have exhibited strong economic performance between 2000 and 2016, which is sort of the end of when some of these studies were done. So what that tells us is that lots of manufacturing towns have transformed themselves. And it's the ones who have tried to rely upon subsidies and protection that are stuck. They are the ones that are having the problems. Youngstown, Ohio is the classic example of a town that opted for intervention rather than reinvention. Another example, of course, is Detroit. Detroit opted for more subsidies, more tariffs. It refused to do anything about overmighty unions. It refused to shake up complacent corporate executives who are very happy with the corporatist-like arrangements that prevailed there. And what has been the result? The result has been the decline of the population of Detroit from about 1.3 million to 800,000 people, lots of automobile companies moving their operations out of Michigan and moving them where? To the south, where guess what? They don't have strong unions that can cause all sorts of labor market problems. So it seems to me when you look at the evidence that the argument that is being presented for this massive reallocation of capital across the American economy for these particular regions, it will fail, it won't produce the jobs that have been promised, and many of these towns have already transformed themselves successfully without this type of intervention.
And I think that's a great place to end because that's a really uplifting story that I don't think gets told enough because it's very profitable for politicians politically to focus on the failures because that allows them to argue for the accumulation of more power to themselves to make decisions over the economy. Whereas successful towns transforming on their own, oftentimes, by the way, with local politicians leading those efforts, they're able to succeed and continue to be a place that people want to live in without an overbearing federal government, and that doesn't really suit a politician's narrative very well at the national level.
Not at all.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this, Sam. This was a great conversation. People will often talk about the China shock to the U.S. economy. By that, they mean some combination of increased imports from China, more U.S. businesses investing in China and vice versa, job losses associated with trade, and U.S. manufacturing being harmed by Chinese competition. Within economics, the term China shock is most associated with papers by the economists David Autor, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson. There is now an entire subfield of China shock research in the economic literature. It might not say what you might have been told that it says. Scott Lincecum of the Cato Institute, in his newsletter for the Dispatch, corrected a lot of misimpressions that many might have about China's economic history and the interaction of that history with the United States. First, there's a fair amount of opportunistic misrepresentation of the original China shock research. It's common in economics papers for researchers to give multiple estimates of their results based on different conditions. That's a smart thing to do because so much about the economy is uncertain, and it helps to have a range of estimates. It is often said that the China shock paper from Autor, Dorn, and Hansen says that China destroyed over 2 million U.S. manufacturing jobs. Lincecum points out that that is actually the upper bound estimate from that paper. The central estimate was only a little over 1 million, so about half of that. And only half of those job losses were in manufacturing. The rest were in other industries. Second, and just as importantly, their papers do not attempt to estimate the job effects for the entire U.S. economy. They are looking at specific local labor markets. That's a worthwhile topic of study in its own right, and it's what these three economists have specialized in with their research. But it just doesn't tell us the whole picture. As Lincecum writes, this methodological issue is really important because the much ballyhooed 2.4 million job losses came amid an economy-wide gain of approximately 2.2 million U.S. jobs, even as the labor market effects of the Great Recession persisted beyond 2011. And those 1 million lost manufacturing jobs, because remember, half of the 2 million, even if we're using the high estimate, are in other industries. He says those 1 million, even if we're using that, accounted for less than 20% of the total manufacturing job losses over the same time frame, and a tiny fraction of the tens of millions of job separations that occur in the United States every year. Thus, even the China shock papers themselves confirm that manufacturing job losses caused by Chinese imports were at best a contributor to, not the main driver of, total factory job declines during the 2000s. The really unique contribution of these China shock papers was about how well or how poorly U.S. workers affected by Chinese imports adjusted to the new labor market. That was really what these researchers were interested in. And as Lincecum notes, the authors of these studies say that their findings would relate to any significant economic disruption, not just Chinese trade. Now, this is a common research technique that economists use. They're interested in a broader phenomenon, such as labor market flexibility, so they find a specific historical example of that phenomenon, in this case, trade with China, and they use that example to research it. The conclusion that they draw from their research is not that disruptions to the economy should be prevented through protectionism. They take for granted that such disruptions will occur, because they will. If not Chinese trade, some new technology, housing market bubble, oil price shock, or any number of other factors could disrupt the economy. That's going to happen. They were researching how people adjust when stuff like that happens. Chinese trade as a reasonably recent historical example. Lincecum goes on to point out that there's plenty of other research on Chinese trade's effect on jobs that finds a variety of different outcomes. The idea that there is only one clear takeaway from the economic literature on this area is wrong. What is true is that U.S. manufacturing, as a share of total employment, has been declining since the 1970s. That trend hardly changed when China joined the World Trade Organization, which is often portrayed as some kind of uniquely awful event in U.S. history. And the total number of manufacturing jobs in the U.S. had been steadily increasing from the end of the Great Recession until COVID, and now it has basically returned to its pre-COVID trend. The U.S. manufacturing sector, on its own, has a higher GDP than the entire country of Italy. And the U.S. manufactures more than Germany, Japan, and South Korea combined. So while it is true that fewer people are employed in manufacturing compared to 50 years ago, and a smaller share of the population is working in factories, the manufacturing sector is still kicking butt. And why would we want to go back to the days when so many more people were working long days in factories to begin with? Now, the China shock isn't the only popular narrative that politicians like to exploit. Another one is that the rich don't pay their fair share in taxes. Politicians say this all the time, without ever really saying what the fair share means. And they're rarely fact-checked on it by the media. CBS News found a way to do it, but it had to frame Americans as dumb first. Americans think they pay too much in taxes. Here's who pays the most and least to the IRS, is the headline. That April 10th story says, most Americans think they pay too much in federal income taxes, and about 6 in 10 mistakenly believe that middle-income households shoulder the highest tax burden. Man, I wonder why they hold that mistaken belief. Could it be that politicians say it all the time and they're rarely corrected by journalists? Well, better late than never, and CBS News reports the facts. The top 1% of taxpayers pay 46% of federal income taxes. The top 10% pay 76% of federal income taxes. And the top 50% pay almost all of it. 98% of federal income taxes come from the top 50% of taxpayers. The average tax rate someone in the top 1% pays is 26%. And the average tax rate someone in the bottom 50% pays is 3%. That number for the bottom 50% is actually a little bit lower because of the way the data is put together. They don't include things like the earned income tax credit. Now, some people will look at this information and draw the conclusion that half the country are freeloaders. Now, that's wrong too. This is just the federal income tax. People in the bottom half of the income distribution still pay payroll tax for Social Security and Medicare, assuming they're employed. They still pay sales tax to their state, whether they're employed or not. They pay gasoline taxes and other excise taxes on specific items. Businesses pass on the impacts of the corporate tax and tariffs through higher prices, just like they do for everyone else. If they own a home, they pay property taxes. If they rent, that's sort of included in their rent. And we all face the tax of inflation when the government overexpands the money supply. But Congress has created a progressive and highly redistributive federal income tax. To the extent that that's what politicians want, and it's what many of them say that they want, well, good news, we already have it. We don't need to hear more about the fair share from the wealthy. If only it didn't take polling showing that Americans are wrong for the media to notice the error in this talking point. Now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show and makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let Sam pick the paper of the episode. It's from March of this year from the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University by Brian Cutzinger and Alexander William Salter. Does price theory have a future? Here's Sam to tell you about it.
One of the things that I think is extremely important for economics, and not just free market economics, but economics in general, is price theory. In many respects, I would argue that economics, properly understood, is very much focused upon prices. We learn about the economy in many respects by understanding how prices function, whether it's in terms of signaling functions, whether it's in terms of helping people to allocate resources properly, whether it's in terms of how people make decisions about what they buy and sell. You really can't talk about economics at all in a serious way without thinking about prices. And of course, there's lots of theory about prices. But a paper I read recently, published by Alexander William Salter and Brian Cutzinger, it was published by the Free Market Institute, which is based in Texas, and it is basically suggesting that if you look at what's being taught in graduate classes, in undergraduate economics, if you look at what is on the syllabi of a lot of economics courses, you find that price theory has basically been marginalized from the discussion. So while prices are very important in terms of things like coordinating information, sending signals, etc., and price theory shows us how trade-offs work, all these really important insights. If we're not studying prices particularly carefully, then I think a lot of the real substance of economics, or part of the toolbox of the well-trained economist, starts to disappear. And what this paper by Salter and Cutzinger does is basically show that if you look at many indices of what's being studied, what's being taught, textbooks that are being used, price theory has been pushed out onto the margins of these types of discussions. And they argue, and I think quite convincingly, that unless you're studying price theory carefully, and even if you don't have price theory at the center of economics, you're going to end up making a lot of mistakes. And what I find interesting is that they use a number of different approaches. They use the Chicago approach, which talks about formal, comparative modeling and careful measurement. They look at the UCLA approach, which talks about how property rights and contractual structures align agents, incentives, and information. And they draw upon the Austrian school in the terms of things like the subjective nature of cost and choice, etc. And they argue that if you look at all these things, price theory is absolutely essential. And it's a serious problem to economics when price theory starts to disappear, or at least get pushed to the side or considered a sort of optional class. And they argue that is exactly what's happening in modern economics instruction. So I thought this was an interesting paper. It's worth reading through because I think they present a fair amount of evidence suggesting that this is indeed happening. And that's a problem, because if it is happening, it means that economists are not using one of the most important tools that they have for understanding economic reality, which is price theory.
That's great. Thanks.
Good.
Does Price Theory Have a Future by Cutzinger and Salter? Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.